does not regulate anything unless it is directly going onto the food shelf. So FDA doesn't regulate the soybean crops that are being used in animal feed and things like that. So, or the industrial sector. So, that's kind of just a risk that we have when using genetically modified foods in general, is because the FDA doesn't regulate it until it's literally being put on the shelves for immediate consumption for us. So, just sort of a risk that we take. And then there's also potential creation of new viruses and toxins as well. So this is, a benefit of it is that it kind of stops some viruses and toxins with pests coming in, but there's the creation of new ones that we have never heard of and have never seen before, just because we're injecting artificial poisons and viruses into these plants, and like there's no system of checks and balances that's really making sure that before it goes into our mouths or into our bodies, or at least or even like if a cow were to eat something that was genetically modified from a soybean plant, and then that cow were to be butchered and to become steaks, there's nothing kind of regulating what the cow was eating that now becomes food for us. So that's sort of just kind of a jarring fact as well. And kind of in addition to this, there's a big concern for lack of labeling. Because the FDA doesn't have to approve these foods, a lot of GM foods and soybeans don't even tell consumers that they are genetically modified. So the FDA is actually a really big supporter of genetically altered foods, and a statement from them is genetically altered products do not affect safety or nutritional quality. So that's what the FDA says. That's kind of their statement. That's their position and platform on all of this. So it's kind of it's just sort of there's a lack of labeling, and it feels a little bit inconsistent, I think, to the average consumer who doesn't know kind of what they're getting themselves into with their food. And I understand why that can be sort of jarring to a consumer when something's not being labeled and no one's telling you. It kind of feels like something's being hidden from you. So now we'll get into a little bit of like the nitty gritty law stuff. So we'll talk about the genes and patenting with these genes. So this is sort of just kind of from the Supreme Court, sort of a historical stance. So the Supreme Court actually denied gene patenting in general, but allows the patenting of synthetic DNA. So that's actually illegal. So patenting genetically modified organisms and kind of the process of that is actually legal because it's not naturally occurring. And scientists kind of come up with these, like the argument here is that scientists sort of come up with these breakthroughs on their own, and they do the science and the testing, so they should be allowed the patent, which seems fair. There is some controversy with this idea because it's not naturally occurring in our genes, and it's manipulated and but then as it's manipulated, it becomes a part of our DNA. So if genetic modification continues to grow and engross our food and even our lives, then you can kind of see how this will become a more tricky situation, just because it just continues to kind of overtake the way we're eating and the way we're living, and then it's like what's natural and what's not, and the line is going to be much more blurred. And actually, according to an article from the Genetic Literacy Project patent for Roundup Ready soybeans, the patent expired in 2015, which sort of sparked a new era of open source GMO seeds. And the University of Arkansas actually released a free replantable version of Roundup Ready soil that's just on the market. So any farmer has access to this. They don't need to kind of go through the lengthy patent situation that they would have had to before 2015. So any farmer at this point can take it, plant it, doesn't have to pay technology or licensing fees, and can replant the seeds from the resulting crop for the next year. So this, I think, is definitely, we've already seen it kind of increase from, I believe it was 84% before the patent was released, and now we're at 94% in the United States alone, which is a huge difference. So now just kind of to conclude, since the first studies on transformation, significant advances have been achieved despite some difficulties regarding soybean regeneration and transformation. So new phenotypes obtained by the transgenic approach are useful for functional gene studies and crop improvement, but kind of the present and future focus moving forward is on continuing improvement of agroeconomic traits and value-added output traits, such as improved nutrition and food functionality. So that's going to be kind of the biggest issue moving forward with genetically modified food and organisms, just because the scientists are doing this so the positives outweigh the negatives. But there are still just kind of a lot of negatives, and a lot of it's up in the air with genetically modified foods in general. So we're kind of trying to do something where soybean improvement can be obtained through genetic engineering and other things. So we're kind of trying to, or scientists, I guess, are trying to find the way to make this the most impactful and beneficial for humans and for the way we consume and eat food. And kind of, it's going to be tricky to see where that line comes into play and how the positives and negatives sort of add up. And then actually, this is from the Journal of American Dietetic Association. They did a study on consumer perception risk associated with eating genetically modified or engineered soybeans. So this is kind of sort of a study more so on perception than anything else. So what they found was, just to kind of sum it up quickly, was that most people at first they were very uncomfortable, with the lack of labeling with genetically modified soybeans. They had no idea that almost everything they see on the shelf that has soy in it in any way was genetically modified at some point. And so that was kind of their first thought at that. And then kind of when they hear some of the positive effects of it, then that sort of changed. So that was really interesting that kind of immediately, without any education on it, people were very, very quick to be against it, very quick to kind of disagree and say, no, I don't like that. It's not being labeled. I don't like that someone is doing that, because it just kind of feels sneaky, even when it might not be. And kind of this comes into the issue is more of a stigma problem with people and genetically modified foods. The perception is that risks are often mentioned and thought of, but the positives are rarely mentioned. So I think a bigger part of this is kind of going to be to start labeling genetically modified foods always, but like kind of hand in hand with that is to make sure that the positive aspects of GM foods are also portrayed, because people just kind of don't know. So that'll go into my thoughts a little bit as well too. So I was honestly very surprised coming into this class and even this assignment. I keep surprising myself kind of with the more I learn about it. But I thought that I was like going to be very anti-genetically modified foods. I didn't really have any I just kind of had that negative stigma that I sort of mentioned from that study. Very similar perceptions to those people that didn't know, and then and I think the reason for that is just because of the negatives are so often assessed and discussed, and the positives are kind of like under the radar. They don't really tell people, it's not really shared with people how many positive aspects there are. So I think that's really interesting to see kind of how my opinions have sort of maybe not completely shifted, but definitely developed over time. Especially for me, kind of seeing the impacts of GM foods in developing and third world countries, that's huge to me, because, GM foods are essential. Things like golden rice and the soybean crops, these are, saving countries like India from world hunger. Like, these are developing countries that have so many people, their population is overtaking their land space, and they can't afford to have sort of like weeds taking over soybean crops and killing all their plants and animals. They just can't really afford that, or people will die of malnutrition. So and especially places like sub-Saharan Africa as well, where the climate and temperatures are not horrible, but very hot and difficult for farming. Genetically modified foods have been huge for them as well in general, just because it has made a big difference, and it has made the plants more sustainable and more able to kind of live through some harsh temperatures and conditions, which has made them stronger and has been able to help feed people and kind of literally provide for people that can't do it otherwise. So I think my biggest thing is that it's not really a black and white issue. I think for me, and with the soybean plant in general, I'm still kind of on the side of the negatives outweigh the positives. I think it's too easy for a domino effect to be created with the soybean plant, where we might make all of our soybean plants genetically modified, and I think that we should all get the opportunity to choose and know what we're eating. I really kind of dislike the lack of labeling with genetically modified foods on our store shelves. I think that we should all be able to know what we're eating and what we're putting into our bodies, and that's sort of our right. And genetically modified foods, though they do a lot for several people, we shouldn't be kind of tricked into eating them or consuming genetically modified organisms just kind of because the FDA says that it doesn't affect you. Um, so I'm still kind of on the side of the negatives outweigh the positives, but I can definitely, my views have definitely kind of developed over time where I can now see that there are a lot of positive aspects, and that kind of genetically modified foods are making a really big difference in how we farm, and a lot of the changes are positive. But that's it. Thank you.